Hi everyone, Stephen Porder here again. Welcome back. Welcome to week 1 of the Climate Solutions course. We're going to get going in earnest now. And although this class is going to be focused on climate solutions, it really is important that you understand the nature of the problem. And so this week we're going to be talking about defining the problem of climate change and understanding its sort of extent and its causes. And next week we'll get more into those causes on the pathway towards solutions. But today, in this module, we're going to be defining the problem and sort of thinking about the scope and extent of the challenge that we face. So we're going to go over 5 basic things in this module. The first is just a very simple and very quick definition of climate. The second is building a little bit of an understanding about what controls the climate. So we're talking about a changing climate in this century and in the past century and in future centuries. So we have to understand what are the controls and how are those controls changing. I've already said that the climate is changing, but I'm going to give you some evidence in the third part of this module about how we know the climate is changing and how much it's changing. And then sort of the most meaty scientific topic, I would say, in this module is why is the climate changing? And we're actually going to talk to a couple of real expert climate scientists about how they think about attributing what we're seeing to a particular cause. That is not, is the climate changing, but why is it changing? Of course, if we want to understand how to slow that change down, we need to understand why it's changing. And then finally, we're going to build on the understanding that those climate scientists give us to help us think about what the future might hold given different actions. And of course, because this course is about solutions, what we're really talking about is how do we change the path that we're on and move towards a different and more sustainable future. So let's start with this very simple question of what is climate? And actually the answer is pretty simple too, at least at first blush. So climate is the long-term average of weather. What I mean by that is that in any particular day or in any particular week or in any particular month or in any particular year, the weather will vary. But in a given place, the climate is relatively definable. So for example, I live in the state of Rhode Island. We have hot summers, hot humid summers, and relatively cold winters. So temperature is a big part of climate, but we also get a certain amount of rainfall. We get about 1 meter a year of rain. So rainfall and the seasonality of that rainfall is also a part of climate. So when you think about the climate of a place, you're thinking about the temperature, the rainfall, and the seasonality of those things. And then when I say it's the long-term average of weather, long-term is in the eye of the beholder. So there's long-term in the geologic sense over tens of thousands or maybe even millions of years. And we can talk about climate change on those timescales. There's a whole field of science called paleoclimatology that thinks about climate change on those timescales. And that's really relevant for putting human changes to the climate system in context. But when we're talking about the problem and solution for climate change in our century, what we're really talking about is decadal changes in the average. So for example, how do the 2020s compare to the 1950s, and how might the 2090s compare to the 2020s? And so the climate that we're going to be focused on most here is the long-term average of weather, and by long-term, in our case, I mean decades to centuries, not millions of years.